Hello, everyone. My name is Madeline Aubrey, and I am your host for the presentation today. Welcome to all our CACOR members, friends, and viewers on our YouTube channel. It is my pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Maude Barlow, a great, caring Canadian. Maude Barlow is an activist and an author. If any of you have had the opportunity to watch a national film board done on Maude called Democracy à la Maude, you will see that she started her career path in activism at a young age. In the beginning, Maude did a lot of work on women's issues at both city and federal level. She moved on to media concentration in Canada, another very interesting area, turned her attention to free trade agreements and their impact on citizens of various countries, which brought her to water with a capital W. She was senior advisor to the UN Secretary General on water rights from 2008 to 2009. Among her other accomplishments, she is co-founder of Council for Canadians and created Blue community projects around the world. Blue communities require towns and cities that sign in to pledge to protect water as a human right and a public trust and ban plastic bottled water. One of her latest projects, Blue Schools. After listening to many interviews with Maude, it is evident that Maude is very much aware of economic inequalities around the world and within countries, and what this means for access to water and water rights. Today, Maude will talk to us about facing the global crisis with knowledge and hope. She will talk about myths, our twin crisis, climate change from a water perspective, share wise hope, and provide knowledge and facts. I think everyone has turned off their videos and are muted. And I just invite everyone who has questions or comments to please put them in the chat box for our Q&A session at the end of this presentation. Welcome to CACOR, Maude.
Thank you so much, Madeline, and thank you everyone for inviting me. My gosh, you make it sound like a terrific event that I'm going to put on here, Madeline. I hope it's okay. It wasn't that, I don't know, it wasn't that great. No, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. I was thinking about just rolling my mind, my memory back to how I got obsessed with this thing called water years ago. And it was when we were debating and fighting the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement back in the 1980s. And we were fighting, by the way, two major proposed commercial water exports, one called the Grand Canal, which would have come from Quebec to the US, and the other was NOAPA, which would have come down the west. So water was on my brain that way. And then we were very worried about a free trade agreement with Ronald Reagan's America, right? And I came out of the women's movement, so my concerns were around social programs and human rights and so on. But I was reading the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and I was reading the index at the end that actually listed all of the tradable goods that were now going to be subject to the rules of trade, which basically is you're giving them over to the market. Government's going to have a lot less to say. It's going to be much more about the markets. And they're among things like shoes and, other things that we would expect to be traded was water in all of its forms, including ice and snow. And that started me on a journey. I could not understand it, although I did believe right then and there that this is connected to those water projects I knew even then that the United States was running out of water. Most of the southern United States was already in trouble, and that this might be a way to bring that water in. And in fact, they also had a proportionality provision in that agreement and then in NAFTA as well, which basically was around energy, but also would have included water if any province started commercially exporting water. we would have been, obliged to continue. So that's how I got started. And to my knowledge, I wrote the first political analysis of who's making decisions around this thing called water. I know I see Bob Sanford is on the call today. Another person who got water on the brain obsession and has spent a lifetime caring about it. So I want to say several things first, just before I get into kind of what we're all doing about it. But the first thing is that I really, and you in your introduction, Madeline, you said that I was going to look at climate from a water perspective, and that's really true because we tend to see everything as a result of greenhouse gas emission-based climate change. So you'll hear reporters and activists and even scientists saying there's a terrible drought, it's caused by climate change. Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe they over extracted that water. Maybe they took all the groundwater out. Maybe they've diverted it for industrial farming or to build cities and all of the things that we do to water from where nature has placed it to where we want it to be. And I actually believe you could end every greenhouse gas emission in the world tomorrow, and we would still have a water crisis. So I just so glad to think separately for a while about water. Yes, the climate change, as we understand it, impacts water, warming lakes, warming rivers, melting glaciers, all of that. But the local hydrologic cycles are impacted when we do bad things around water, and that impacts climate. And just as much as problems with climate impact water, I would say that vice versa needs to be understood. And so thinking blue as well as green really matters. There are basically twin crises that we're dealing with. One is ecological and the other is human, although of course they're deeply connected. Simply put, the planet is running out of accessible, clean water. Doesn't mean it's not running, that it's running out of water. It's the same water, same amount of water, and same water that was here when the dinosaurs roamed. But we have diverted and polluted and abused our freshwater systems to the point where the UN calls water scarcity the scourge of the earth and says that by 2030, the demand for water will outstrip supply by 40%, which if you think of it is an absolutely incredible and devastating statistic. But in our world of deep entrenched inequality, the lack of access to water and sanitation is also one of the greatest human rights violations of our time. In fact, one could argue, if you just strictly look at numbers involved, it is the greatest human rights violation. 1/4 of the world's population doesn't have access to adequate drinking water, and in many cases, no access to drinking water at all, clean drinking water. And 1/2 the population of the world doesn't have access to adequate sanitation. You'll remember at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we were all told, wash your hands, to keep your hands clean, keep your body clean, your utensils clean, and so on. Well, half the population of the world didn't have any way to do that. We thought of inequality as being about vaccines, but inequality started there as well with water. Now, I have to say, nobody's denying this. You're not getting anybody saying this isn't true. The evidence is so strong. The numbers are so clear. Where there is disagreement is in the solution. What is to be done with these twin crises, this water crisis? And basically, put in its starkest forms, it's basically, is water a commodity or is it a commons? That's the most basic way to look at this division. On one side, you get people, business leaders, some political leaders, certainly many business schools around the world, certainly many corporations, many industry groups saying water is a commodity and should be put on the open market like oil and gas and let the market decide what will happen. And that is one form of a solution. Many more people would die, but it is in fact one solution to make it a commodity. Versus those of us who deeply believe that water is a human right. It's a commons and it's a public trust, and it must be maintained under public governance. It must be transparent governance. Communities need a great deal of authority around community water. And above all, it must not be handed over to private interests whose Bottom line, no matter how nice the people who are running this company are, bottom line has to be a profit. Now, there are many forms of commodification taking place. There's privatization of municipal services, which started in France in the 80s, and then with Margaret Thatcher in 1987, with England and Wales. Pinochet, the dictator in Chile, privatized all his country's water. And then the World Bank came in and started saying to countries of the global south, if you want funding for your water services, you have to bring in a private company. And there were actually water wars, the famous one in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where the army was brought out because the people said, we don't have the money. The company not only tripled the price of water, they said, we own the water coming from the sky. And if we catch you capturing it, we'll put you in jail. So this has been a very deep and huge fight. It's been a disaster. If you followed in England, the outgoing conservative government was saying it was a mistake, and we're talking about remunicipalizing Thames Water and others. Massive salaries for the CEOs, pollution. The new environment minister, the Labour environment minister, says there is not a river in Great Britain anymore that's not polluted due to the cavalier way these companies have treated this. So we really have strong evidence anywhere this has happened. Then bottled water is another form of privatization. Global sales, unfortunately, are booming in spite of a lot of political work good groups are doing, universities are doing. The sale of bottled water is slated to double by 2030, up to about sales of US $500 billion a year. Then we get the financialization of water and nature. And I've just finished the first draft of a report for the Global Alliance on the Rights of Water on the financialization of nature, because you will have followed the fact that many people and leaders are now saying, well, it's not just about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, it's about protecting biodiversity, restoring watersheds, and so on. And there's the 30 by 30 protection and all of that. And so suddenly there's a great deal of money out there for biodiversity protection. And I'm afraid that there's a very huge movement to basically bring nature into the market economy. Basically, a lot of the companies are saying, well, governments blew it, which is often true, I have to say. But my answer is we still need good governance, right? But the question then, or the answer then, is bring nature into market, put a price on it, and let it fend for itself and compete for itself in that system. So you're going to hear a lot more. Well, you've heard of carbon trading, but you're going to hear a lot more about ecosystem services. I mean, even the term ecosystem services, service us, blue bonds, biodiversity assets trading, nature bonds, wildlife conservation bonds, nature-based solutions, plastic offsets. It's just an incredibly interesting and endless series of ways of. One poet wrote, and I forget his name now, he said he hated to see ideas of the past coming forward dressed up in the colors of the future. It's just the same kind of greed, but it's really, really deeply entrenched at the UN, at the World Bank, and so on. So of course it's affecting water markets, water trading. The US started water markets or water trading, or water rights, I should say, about 100 years ago, basically encouraging settlers and industry to settle in the West, and saying you forever they would have rights to the water that they were given at the time. And now you have landowners separating the water from the land and selling the water separately. Chile has by far the largest water market in the world, and Bloomberg just did a study, in-depth report, basically saying, well, it's the market is booming. Lots of people, lots of corporations are making tons of money, but the farmers aren't. They can't afford the water that flows by their farms because it's all spoken for. A good half of the Murray-Darling is spoken for. And again, with Pinochet, he set up a water code that not only privatized the services, but also privatized the water itself. So big mining companies, say from Canada, can come in and bid on the actual market. We also have water pollution trading now, which is very much like carbon trading. It's an offset. You're allowed to continue to pollute, but you offset it by doing something good somewhere else. And if you take a certain amount of pollution out of the water somewhere, or you give bottled water to poor kids somewhere, you are allowed to continue to pollute where you are. And this is being used by big ag industry, the big animal factory farms, in particularly one in Chesapeake Bay in the US. And then there's the water futures trading. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange 2 years ago basically allowed for the first time a market in water assets. So this isn't actual water. This is that you would buy a certain number of assets at a fixed price, and assuming that the crisis is going to get worse and you're going to make money on its sale. So clearly, I feel if the dead hand of the market is allowed to determine the fate of water, the profit motive, not water protection or water justice, will prevail, and it will be very hard to deal with the coming crisis. So Canada, we have what some of us call the myth of abundance, which is the notion that we have so much water in this country and so much land and so much of so much that we don't have to protect it properly, and we have not in the past. From mining to extractive industries, to fracking, to nutrient overload. Take a look at Lake Winnipeg. We have many, many, many issues. I'm hoping Julian Branch might be on this call because he's doing some wonderful work on the issue of asbestos in water pipes here in Canada and the US. Do look him up. And as we all know, we had the crisis in Indigenous communities for many, many years, one of the most shameful parts of Canada's past. But I have to say, and I want to give credit where credit is due, because when we ask governments to do something and they do it, I think we need to say so. There has been great improvement under the current government. 145 of the long-term drinking water advisories have been lifted, and there are, I think, something like 32 still to go, 32 too many. But this is the first government that has dealt with it. We now have the Canada Water Agency, which I think has promise. A lot of us want to know a whole lot more about what they're going to be doing. But I think one of the mandates is to coordinate water policy and water practice, because right now it's municipalities, First Nations, provinces, and federal government, and it's all a bit of a mishmash. So making sense of that is an incredibly important thing. The government, again, updated the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which groups like Eco-Justice feel was a tremendous improvement. Others are still critical, but certainly I think the revival under Harper, the science, the water programs were just decimated. There was nobody left to take care of the Environmental Protection Act enforcement. So I do think there have been improvements, and I think there's much more awareness. I want to talk to you about the project that we started when I'm retired now from the Council of Canadians, but we launched in 2009 because Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister, and he was promoting privatization of water services in Canada, Canada's municipalities, saying if you want federal funding for your municipal upgrades, and most cities need it, believe me, or new pipes and new infrastructure, you have to you won't get any money from the federal government unless you move to a public-private partnership. So we had a conference in 2009 with CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and we thought, we don't want to always be against something, against privatization, against pollution, against this. Do we have a vision of our own? And we came up with this concept called Blue Communities, where we went out to Canadian municipalities and said, when they come calling and telling you have to go private, don't do it. Take a pledge. And the pledge to become a blue city, a blue community, was that they would recognize, as Madeline said, the right to water and sanitation as human rights. They would promote publicly financed, owned, and operated water and wastewater services. So no privatization of water services. And where public water is available, that they would not supply or sell bottled water. They would phase it out on municipal premises and at municipal events. And it was incredible. It just took off like that. And we have close to 50 municipalities, including big ones like London, Vancouver, Montreal, that are blue community cities. And then I moved to Europe. I was in Bern, Switzerland in 2012 and met the then mayor, a wonderful man, Andreas Schappet, his name was. And he loved it. He said, would you, because Nestle, his water headquarters was in Switzerland. He said, would you come here and let's make Bern a blue community? I did the next year, and Bern, the city of Bern, the University of Bern, and the whole Reformed Church in Switzerland became a blue community. And so it moved beyond Canada. Had never been my dream, but of course it was wonderful. And in Europe they added a fourth provision, which is to promote public partnerships instead of public-private partnerships in the global South. And by my estimate, there are about 25 million people living in official blue community towns and cities around the world. This includes Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Thessaloniki, Los Angeles. One of my favorites is in Berlin, where they said, well, the water coming out of the tap is clean. Because they ended their privatization, and a few years later they became a blue community. And they said, the water is inexpensive and clean. What can we do? Well, they had a lot of migrants and a lot of homeless living in parks and under freeways and stuff. And so they put money to promote the human right to sanitation into waterless washrooms, wooden structures, to give people privacy and dignity. It was a small step to what's needed, obviously, but there are just so many ways we can look at this issue. And in 2016, the World Council of Churches, representing, I think, 500 million people, became a blue community and became a role model for other faith-based communities. And many universities, including here in Canada, St. Michael's at U of T, St. Paul here. I live in Ottawa, unceded territory, the Algonquin Anishinaabe, became blue communities. And basically, they take a pledge to teach their students about the need to understand water, to care for water, to see water as being something sacred, and to protect not only water itself, but the human right to water. And some of the universities in Europe that have taken this on have got whole programs around water that they have, intersectional programs from human rights and geography and so on. Very, very exciting. And we have just launched from the Council of Canadians our Blue Community Schools project. And you can go on the council site and look for Blue Community Schools. And a Blue Community School is the site offers two things. One is a wonderful material, a webinar that has lesson plans and films and books and groups that teachers can go to assign their students to look up this, water watchers in Wellington County and so on, learn about what others are doing. Lots of information on the Indigenous fight for water rights, and then information around the water fight around the world, which we will keep up to date. So lots of good stuff for teachers to use, but a school can also apply to become a Blue Community School, and they'll get a certificate, and we'll have a service and so on. And so if any of you know of a school, this is K to 12, that would like to become a Blue Community School, let us know. And they only have to pledge, again, 3 pledges to educate about the importance of taking care of water, protecting water, promoting the human right to water, and phasing out the sale of bottled water or provision of bottled water on school property. You're not saying the kids can't bring water if that's what their parents want, but you're not going to provide it anymore. And a big part of the education is around plastics and the whole plastics issue and the footprint that plastics have generally, but the huge footprint that just bottled water alone has is incredibly important. So I've recently spent a lot of time thinking and writing about hope. Madeline mentioned this at the beginning. My last book was called Still Hopeful: Lessons from a Lifetime of Activism. And I write about the need to be hopeful, to build hope into our movements, to not be disappointed or devastated or derailed when you don't win something, because you're not going to win everything, and that's just going to be a recipe for you to back away, that you have to take the long view. And I borrowed a term called wise hope from a wonderful American spiritualist, Joan Halifax. She works with men on death row, so you could imagine she has something interesting to say about hope. And wise hope for me is vowing to take a commitment to protecting all that is good for future generations and the planet, knowing that you can't control it all. And that's hard for a type A like me, right? But you can't control it all, and that's the way it is. And you can do what you can, but you take action anyway. You put your hand out and you touch the universe in a place where you can make a difference. And this is really important. You have faith that others are doing the same thing. Not exactly what you're doing, but something similar, something working towards a common good. And that faith that this is happening is extraordinarily important, which is why I think the Blue Communities concept really appeals to faith-based groups, because they care about the environment, they care about the commitment to the creator, and they see the need to have both hope and faith. So there are many reasons for hope. First of all, of course, was the UN declaration in 2010. I was there in the balcony when the UN recognized the United Nations, recognized the human rights to clean water and sanitation. And since then, almost 50 countries have either amended their constitution or brought in a separate water law to recognize the human right to water. It's been an incredibly important provision. The trend to water privatization has been reversed. Basically, in Canada, it's almost gone. There's just a couple of wastewater services that are still in private hands. New Brunswick, I think, a couple, but mostly across the country, they were privatizations. They started like Hamilton and said that didn't work. We have a group called Transnational Institute in Europe counts and monitors this, and they say close to 350 towns and cities around the world tried privatization of water services and have rejected it. And even the World Bank isn't pushing it anymore. They offer it as an option, but they're not saying this is the only option and you won't get funding, unless. We had a big win in the new NAFTA, the Canada, US, Mexican trade agreement. And that is the ISDS, the provision, Chapter 11, that allowed corporations to sue each other's governments if they didn't like the laws. And Canada paid well over $200 million to American corporations who didn't like our laws. That's gone. And do not thank the Canadian negotiators for that. I'll tell you one crazy thing. It was Donald Trump who wanted it gone because he didn't want the American manufacturers, particularly car manufacturers, having the right to sue governments in the global south if they, brought in rules or something. He wanted those companies to come home. This is when he was fighting NAFTA. So it was him. It was Trump. Only thing he's ever done that I can think of is worthy of anything. But we did get rid of ISDS, and we have been fighting ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, all over the world with some real success. Another huge fight and win has been led by a Canadian named David Boyd. David Boyd is a BC-based lawyer, human rights lawyer, who just finished his second term as UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights in the environment. And he led a fight to get the United Nations National Assembly to recognize the right to a healthy environment. And David is working with the nexus of the right to a healthy environment and the rights of nature, the rights of Mother Earth, to say a right combines them. You can't have a right to humans without a right to Mother Earth, without a right to nature at the same time. Really incredible movement there. I believe there's been a huge, and I said this earlier, understanding of the need to protect and regenerate biodiversity. It's growing exponentially. And it's my worry, as I said earlier, is that it might be hijacked by interests that say, let's just pull it all into the market and situate it there. My goodness, I know I'm speaking about hope, but there is just one proposal by the World Bank, because you'll know of this 30 by 30. 30 by 30 is a promise, but many governments have taken as proposed internationally that by 2030, countries will set aside and protect biodiversity and their land and their water. 30% of their biodiversity will be protected by 2030. But the concern is that in some countries that's being used to clear the land of the people who live there, like the Maasai people, and several communities in Africa where pristine wilderness must be pristine, and that means nobody there. So it's quite controversial. But here's the thing: the World Bank says, well, that's an awful lot of land. 30% of the world's land and water mass has to be protected. Where would we find these? Well, we'd find them in national parks and provincial parks and state parks and what they call PAs, protected areas. I come across this proposal by the World Bank to make all of the PAs, the protected areas, the national parks around the world, part of the 30 by 30, where government would still technically own the land, but they would open up its use to public-private partnerships so that these companies could come in and basically divide up nature into its units and protect it by doing whatever they conceive of that they want to do with it. It's like really, really quite frightening. If we take this concern with biodiversity, if it goes in that direction, as opposed to something that's real. I quote often Martin Luther King, who said, legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. We need good law. We have the right to good governance, and to turn over the protection and restoration of nature and biodiversity to water pollution trading type people and companies really would be the wrong answer. And I'm very, very keen on this rights of nature. Some of you will know about the Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature, and if not, please go to the website. This is an international alliance of organizations, groups, academics, indigenous peoples, and so on, communities coming together to promote a kind of protection of nature from the bottom up, although there are countries like Ecuador and Bolivia that have actually named protections in their constitution. But mostly it's coming from the bottom up, where waves in Brazil have just been named, given legal personhood. Very interesting case. And where local communities, very often indigenous people, say under our rights under UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have a responsibility to take care of the resource base of in our territories, like the water and the trees and the animals and so on. This is our responsibility, and so they are declaring nature in different ways. Having legal rights, legal personhood. And if you remember that corporations given by the Supreme Court of the United States were given legal personhood rights. So there's no reason not to say that we couldn't have the same concept. So when there's a terrible oil spill, mostly if there's damage, you have to prove you had damage to your property, your business, or your home or whatever. Well, who's speaking for the wildlife? Who's speaking for the aquatic life that's generations damaged and so on? So this is a movement, I believe, whose time has come. And the fastest growing part of this movement are rights of rivers. And there's a fabulous project called the Magpie River in northern Quebec, where the local Innu people have worked with local councillors to declare the Magpie, which is a mighty, mighty, wonderful river running into the St. Lawrence, to have legal personhood. And the Magpie River has 9 rights, including the right to flow, the right to regenerate, and so on. But my favorite right of the Magpie is that it has the right to sue governments and corporations who would hurt and destroy it. And the film is really wonderful. It's called I Am Magpie, and you can see it on CBC Gem. It was on The Nature of Things, the Suzuki based series, and I would highly recommend it. And since the magpie became legally named a person, and the local Innu people are the guardians of the river, the Athabascan First Nations are saying that they are coming forward to make the Athabasca a protected area. Near where I live, the local communities and First Nations people here are working to have the Gatineau River declared a legal personhood. And many communities along the St. Lawrence on both sides of the river, both countries, are looking towards declaring the St. Lawrence River to be protected as well. So who knows what this is going to mean? Like, who knows? I expect one day it'll end up in the Supreme Court of Canada. You know, Indigenous rights and nature's rights, Mother Earth rights versus some company or some government that wants to put in yet another hydroelectric dam. But this notion of coming up from the bottom is a very moving one. And I think it's very exciting if you put it together with the right to a healthy environment and then the human right to water. So I'm going to end the formal part of this. I think that's the right amount of time that I've been speaking, and so we leave lots of time for us to have a chat. It's my dream to turn the whole world blue. One city, one university, one school, one kid at a time. I was at an event in Whistler, as a matter of fact, and we were doing a walk and talk. This was something lovely through the old growth forest, and it was kind of a day when it was sort of misty, kind of a soft rain. And this woman who'd heard me the night before came up and she ran up to me and she said, "I'm a Blue community." And I said, "All by yourself?" And she said, "You bet." She said, "I knew nothing about this. Like, this was just, I knew nothing about it. I'll never drink bottled water again. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to learn." She came from a small community in interior BC. She said, "I'm going to learn all I can about water services in my community, and I'm going to keep my eye open about all that. I'm going to care what happens to First Nations communities near me. I'm going to teach my kids about the water issue. I'm a walking Blue community," she said to me in that lovely rainforest. And that's how change happens. And we know that. And we also know that the earth is hurting, and we know that there is a great deal of pain with the conflicts, the horrible wars and conflicts going on in our world. So holding on to that hope is just incredibly important, because if we have one responsibility, it's passing that torch of hope to the next generation. Otherwise, we shouldn't be forgiven. And two quotes just to end. One is our wonderful David Suzuki, who says, "If we stop hurting nature, it will be more forgiving than we deserve," which I think is gorgeous. And the other is from the late great Carl Sagan, who was ahead of his time in his understanding of what was coming. And he said this: "Anything else you are interested in is not going to happen if you cannot breathe the air or drink the water. Don't sit this one out. Do something. You are, by accident of fate, alive at an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maude. That was very interesting. And I think there'll be a lot of there'll be questions on some of the things you said to get a bit more information. We'll start with Richard. Richard, if you want to put your video on, you'll be on first. And then if Ruth, you'll prepare, you will be next. And Richard, if you would just phrase your comment there into a question.
Yes, thank you. Madeline, that was a great, Maude, sorry, that was a great talk. I was wondering, are you aware of any research going on asbestos in water? The reason I'm asking is because one of the board members of Prevent Cancer Now actually has done extensive research on asbestos in water, and actually they made a W5 episode of it, but he continues on this. But I'm just wondering, are you aware of other research being done on asbestos in water?
Thank you so much, Richard. In fact, I've been in contact with Julian.
Perfect, yes.
Just yesterday, in fact, I chair the board of Food and Water Watch in the United States, and Julian and you probably have done a fair amount of research on the issue in the United States, which I didn't know about. Mm-hmm. And I put him yesterday in touch with the director of the water program, Food and Water Watch. And I'm thinking that I know some folks at Greenpeace in the US, and I want to do the same thing. So I've been learning about it through him and doing reading. He's been sending me incredible information. There's apparently the city of Calgary has got a terrible legacy of asbestos in cement pipes, if I'm
Ah,
correct.
yes.
And so you know way more about it than I do. Appreciate if you could say a few words about it rather than, but the answer,
Oh,
quick answer is yes, I know about it, but nowhere near what I should. And I would ask you to say a little more about it.
well, I just think in essence, there are no rules about nobody measures the amount of asbestos in water, and we have thousands and thousands of miles of asbestos water pipes which are constantly breaking down in Canada and in the US. And nobody, like, there seems to be no organized research effort on it. I mean, Julian is really the only person I know who's been doing anything on it. And but it's not public knowledge, and people aren't aware of it. But for instance, when the Calgary water break happened, then people became aware, but a little bit, but only there locally. And it's a huge issue,
Yeah.
and we are facing this across the nation. And actually, um, our leader of our Green Party actually raised it as an issue in Parliament for us. But it's really a huge issue.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. I couldn't agree with you more. And I raised it as one of the, along with fracking and other problems around water. And thank you and Julian or Julius for doing this work, because it's really incredibly important. I totally support it.
Thank you. We'll have you give your question, Ruth, and then Meg, if you want to put your video on, you will be next.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Maude, for everything you've done as a champion. I'm coming in with I don't believe in hope. I think that we can be hopeful, but then there's the realities behind hope. So I've been working on nature-based solutions and had funding for it. I want to tell you just a little bit of how poorly it's going, and it's not a surprise. So I'm funded. I've worked with the Ministry of Transportation, an improvement district responsible for delivering clean potable water to the community on Salt Spring Island, and had everyone on site, including the board, to reduce phosphorus and sediment loadings into the lake water supply, which has been affecting recharge, using wetland restoration. Everything was lined up. It was supposed to start this year, 2 weeks ago, but there was a board change about, I don't know, 2 months back. And this board said that they want as much water as possible, even if it's contaminated and has phosphorus in it, because they want to lift the moratorium on new house construction. And I'm not, so I wanted to clean it to improve the amount of water that could actually cleanly go into the lake, which is treated as a reservoir, but that's a different matter. The board was on side, the 3 members of the board changed, and all of a sudden I was told 2 weeks before, 10 days before I was going to drop shovel, that with all the support of all the governments, that I couldn't do it anymore. So now I'm running really fast to figure out what to do with my funder and how to, redo this with everything you can imagine. So hope is one thing. Hope is like, I hope someone else does this. But the reality is, we can't have hope because we can get the money, we can start to move something, and it can still be killed. And so it's not a good use of time to think about hope. It's more practical. We can give funding for nature-based solutions, but they can still fail, funded with approval, with permits, with everything that you need.
Well, Ruth, I'm really terribly sorry about this particular situation. And when I talk about hope, I don't talk about Pollyanna-ish. Everything's good. In fact, this Joan Halifax, I quote her, she says, optimism and pessimism have a lot in common because in neither case are you required to do anything. Wise hope says you face it right up here and you don't look away, and you know that you're not going to win everything. In fact, you might not even win as much as you, but that you don't stop caring. and that you don't give up, and that you give that sense that we can make a difference to another generation. So I'm not talking about a kind of, oh, everything's okay, because everything's not okay. And your example is just awful. And I guess that I don't know this particular situation. It seems to me you've got the housing up against the environment, political, competing political demands is what it sounds like to me. And we're going to see a lot more of that in British Columbia. We've got, we've got the rise of this new party, and they're pretty right wing. And so how far are they going to pull the NDP over? It's a very, very big question. No. I don't want you to think it's a kind of a Pollyanna-ish hope, because it's not.
No, it's more a comment on the political. Like, we can have hope and we can do grassroots thing, which is essential. If it doesn't happen grassroots, it's not going to happen. But we've got this cement wall, which is the politics, that even when everything is aligned, it's still the impediment for us.
Yeah. I'm terribly sorry about that particular case. I hadn't heard of it, but it doesn't surprise me. We've had so many disappointments around water and fracking in BC and water. And the federal government, actually promotes the bottled water industry, and actually promotes foreign companies coming in and selling water, particularly in BC, and we've lost. We had a case where somebody on Vancouver Island actually led a fight against a particular bottled water taking near him. And he went to the Federation of Municipalities, whatever it's called, and they got unanimously supported, calling on the government to bring in a moratorium on bottled water takings. And the government just like, here, it's just every municipality wants this. We didn't hear. So it's very frustrating, and I'm 100% with you. It feels sometimes like one step forward and 10 steps back, but take a deep breath.
Well, I'd just like to add, Ruth, that I hope that if this when this goes up on YouTube, maybe you might even get some reaction from other people who might have ideas and be able to help out. Hopefully, I mean, nothing wrong with spreading the word. It's great. Thank you, Meg. If you next will be Dave. So Meg, if you'd like to state your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually leave prevent cancer now. It was mentioned earlier. I just take a minute to ask people who are not speaking to mute, because there's echoes on the line. Anyway, I did put in the chat a link to our resources, a landing page, and then there's related posts about the asbestos cement water pipes issue. And this is actually a case of the government of Canada just saying that there is no problem. Despite the research from the States, in Canada, we have no standard, we have no methodology. It is impossible to send a water sample to a lab in Canada and have it properly analyzed for asbestos. There was one lab in Canada that adapted some process that they use for wallboard, and said that they were going to measure asbestos in water. Like, there is no methodology at all. And Health Canada, usually you talk about the precautionary principle, this kind of thing. And Health Canada says that there is no consistent, convincing evidence that asbestos in water is harming Canadians. How are we going to collect data and develop any kind of evidence about that if we can't even measure asbestos in water? So they put up this big, speaking of concrete walls or asbestos walls. And so I'm wondering, like, when you're up against this completely daft denial of evidence, denial of even the possibility of accruing that evidence, what do you do? I think it's crazy.
Well, thank you, Meg. Again, I can't claim to know what Julian and you and others know and have an incredible work you've done, and I thank you for it. It seems to me we need to get organizations on board. We've been fighting this line 5, which is an oil pipeline that goes under the Mackinac Strait of Mackinac.
That's
and
all.
we had no support in Canada, like federal government, provincial governments, local governments. Everybody said we need that oil or the gas. We can't touch that 67-year-old, I think it is, pipeline that if it ruptures would just do terrible damage to the Great Lakes. But one by one, we've been getting environmental defense, and now Wellington Water Watchers, and I see Sierra Club now are taking positions. And I think as we build a bit of a movement here together, that's when the governments start to listen. So this is, to me, I mean, I'm retired from my organization now, or I would be pledging it right here. I'd say, oh, we'll be working on this tomorrow. And it's not for me to do that anymore. It's got under new management. But I do deeply believe in movement building. I do deeply believe in getting groups together and coming together, even, if it would be possible to bring the important environmental groups and water justice groups together in Canada for a day-long symposium to really hash this out, because as long as it's just a small group of individuals, it's really hard to move things. I'm a deep believer in building movements and getting groups together to make noise together and to make plans together.
Well, thank you very much, and you've certainly been an inspiration.
Thank
you. Okay, Dave?
So I assume you're coming to me. Everybody might have noticed I put a few links in the chat. And I think the reason that you came to me is an observation I made, which is this. Hope's just not a very good strategy. I think we can have hope no matter where we are. We could be standing in front of a firing squad and still have hope that all of the bullets are going to be duds. Just doesn't do any good.
Well, I feel that, and that's what my book was about, Still Hopeful, is that if you don't bring joy and hope and healing and support to each other in movement building, people burn out. And you have to be in it for the long run. And to be in it for the long run, you have to take action. Greta Thunberg, as you know, sat in her room for 2 years when she first found out about the climate crisis. So devastated, so anxiety filled that she could hardly come down and have a meal. And she said one day she just got up and went down to sit in front of City Hall in Stockholm. And she had no idea she was going to launch a youth movement, but she had to take action. And she said when she took action, she found hope. And when she found hope, she took action. And it's those two things together. It's the joy of coming together, working together, and supporting each other. And I deeply believe that we have to build in self-care and care for others. And you're not going to do that if you just look at the negatives. And I've had lots of wins in my life. So, and I like winning better than I like losing.
I put it a slightly different way. That is, when things get really bad, you don't rely on hope. You rely on grim determination.
Of course, but they're not mutually exclusive, in my opinion. Not at all.
Well, I think they are, because every time I look around and see people who are full of hope about something, they don't act. They say, oh, well, I hope it's going to work out. Somebody else is going to do it.
Well, that's not been my experience, but that's okay. We're allowed to differ.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, John Blake, if you would open your mic and for video. And Ted, if you want to get ready for next.
Okay. Yes. This was a fascinating, especially after your book, which hit the press many years ago. Your name has been associated, Maude Barlow, with water. Now, there's much that's been said about water as a right, but what about especially in these days of dangers coming from the damage that we've done to our environment, what about water as a threat? Since we have gone down the wrong path as far as the Club of Rome is concerned, we should have heard, for example, about freedom from damage by a neighboring country caused by flooding, especially flooding caused irresponsibly. So my question is, have you ever heard in UN circles about water as a threat? This is not an idle question. I was asked when I was on posting with Foreign Affairs in Los Angeles to attend a law conference on water, asked by Ottawa. And I found that fascinating because, well, we didn't worry about water back in the 80s. Anyway, the UN is the place where these fresh ideas sometimes come forth. So water as a right, okay, that's all very ideal, but what about water as a threat? Have you heard of this as a new thought now that the UN is dealing with new problems every day and every year?
Well, yes, there's a great body of work on water as a threat or as a source of conflict. Water is a source of conflict between countries. Water is a source of conflict between groups or tribes or maybe different ethnic groups within a country, border issues, upstream people using way more of the water than the downstream people are getting, or the downstream communities. The best source for this is Peter Glick and the Pacific Institute in the United States. They do I think it's every 2 or 3 years, they put out a very comprehensive report on water conflict and water as a threat. And they say very clearly that water conflict is rising in the world. There's no question about that. I mean, take a look at the Middle East. Take a look at the water being used as a weapon in Russia, Ukraine, Sudan. I mean, you name it, you're going to find water is a piece. If it's not a huge cause, it's at least a piece of the cause of any conflict that you're looking at. And water as a spoil of war. How do you just, when Saddam Hussein was in power, he would drain the swamps, which is where many people live. They actually lived, they were water people living in these communities and getting by on boats and so on. But a lot of people he considered enemies lived there, so he would drain them. So water can be used as a source. Same with Syria, with Assad. I mean, he cut water off to people he didn't, his enemies. So water as a threat, as a source of conflict, and as a source of war is a huge issue, especially in a world or a planet running out of clean, accessible water. It's even more important and more damaging and more frightening than possible. Peter Glick also does, however, he also keeps track, and his organization, Pacific Institute, keeps track of water as a source of commons, of people working together, of coming together as opposed to conflict, and where water has been used as a source of peace. And he still argues that water is more often a source of peace than it is a source of war in our world, and that he puts forward the notion that water could be used as a as a way for differing sides to come together. We may, your grandfather may have hated my grandfather, and you may have but your father tried to kill my father, but we're on this small little piece of water, and it's declining, and it declines for us, it declines for you. Can we come together and put aside ancient grievances to protect this common heritage? And the whole concept of water and peace, and water being used as a source of peace, is a really important and exciting part of the UN. I don't tend to hang out at the UN, so it's not that I hang around there and would hear this, but I do know that water and peace is a very huge issue, as is war and peace, war and conflict.
But I would just press the point for a moment of the responsibility to control one's own water. And you see, what I mean is, it's all very well for the media to give dramatic shots of floods. But in the case where countries have carelessly allowed flooding of water in their country, which then floods a neighboring country.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know what
well,
I mean?
you look at the Nile River and the areas, and you look at China and the water that China is damming and keeping for itself that basically belongs to many countries downstream. But you can even look at a more friendly kind of example, and that is Switzerland is considered the water tower of Europe. A great deal of the water comes from the Swiss Alps and comes through Switzerland. If you've been to Zurich or Bern, you see those beautiful blue rivers running through this ice water coming off the glaciers. But these glaciers are melting. So now the Switzerland is beginning to say, well, maybe we're going to dig great big lakes, great big holes to capture this water as it comes down. Well, people downstream are saying, well, wait a minute, is that your water? It's water in glaciers up there, but can you really claim that to be your water? I foresee more conflict unless we understand that water can be used as a sign of peace or as a source of peace, because it's not just going to be in places where there's already struggle. As the planet runs out of clean, accessible water, either through damage through the floods or over extraction or fires and all of the things we know of, it's going to be a contested area. And many, many refugees, many migrants are running away from a lack of water. There may also be violence in their communities. There may also be starvation, but starvation may be because there's no water to grow the crops. So as a source of peace or a war, big question. Yep. But thank you. Great question.
Okay, Anne, I noticed you have your hand up. So if you wanted to put your mic on, your video on, and be ready after Ted.
I like this, by the way. Most organizations don't do this. They have it written down. It's so nice to be able to see the person.
Yeah, well, we're not really organized. That's one of our real advantages.
Well, you done good here.
Yeah, Canada is viewed internationally as the water source for the entire planet and per capita and the amount we have. And so sometimes it's a little odd when I work overseas where people say, why don't we export it? And we even did at one point when I was working for the Canadian government in the Caribbean, trying to figure out how we could get water for the water poor countries of that region by exporting Canadian water in bulk to help their farmers, to help their drinking water, all of that. And we actually found solutions that were largely ecologically neutral in as much as they took clean, fresh water from areas where no one was using it and caught it as it entered the ocean before it became salt. And we felt it would be a very good source to export. Never went anywhere. Turned out to be a lot cheaper to use energy to do solar solar desalinization and so on. But nevertheless, a lot of the world still looks at Canada as some place that maybe we can come to get water. So it's the counterpoint almost of what we've been talking about. But I just thought I'd put that in front of you because a lot of the world sees Canada as a potential drinking fountain.
Well, they shouldn't. For one thing, yes, technically, we're told we have 20% of the world's fresh water. In fact, we have about 6.5% of the planet's available fresh water. That's the water you can use without taking down the source. It's like your bank. The interest. This is the interest. But if you don't want to take down your bank account, you need to leave that water there. Number one. Number two, Nature put water where it's needed. There are entire ecosystems depending on the water systems there. And when we start to change them dramatically, we already know what we've done with diverting water from, under cities, and we bury streams and rivers and stuff under our cities. We already know the damage that that's doing. Where fresh water meets salt water is an extremely important area for fish spawning, for wildlife. And if you start taking that fresh water, you're going to change that whole dynamic, that whole ecosystem dynamic. Number 3. Number 4, it's very energy intensive to move water. Water is very heavy. Much, much better to help other places to conserve and preserve and use stormwater. I mean, we know that you can green deserts if we do the right thing, if we capture, there are so many examples in southern Australia when the Murray-Darling was running out of water a few years ago, which is going to do again. There were 2 cities. One, Adelaide, brought in the heavy desalination plants, expensive, just a horrible project. And another one called Salisbury decided to listen to an engineer there who said, let's build a whole bunch of wetlands and storage spaces for water, and we'll whatever rain comes, we will capture. Whatever stormwater comes, we will capture. It's like a study in. They brought back the birds. They brought back the animals. They greened the desert. They're even selling their excess water to Adelaide now. We have solutions that belong to our local ecosystems, but to massively change them would be, in my opinion, a mistake. And let me tell you, Alberta and British Columbia, and even to an extent Saskatchewan and Manitoba, are in drought. There is no water to spare. There's no water for there should be no water being ruined for fracking. Like, we have our own issues here, and I think what people have got their eyes on are the Great Lakes. And
the one that they really have the eyes on right now is Newfoundland.
Yes.
And the glacier melts from the northern parts of Labrador. And that, in fact, is what was involved with the Caribbean coming to us and saying, how much can we get? And the idea was essentially, even, by the way, looking at floating icebergs down. It was that ridiculous.
I'm not opposed to floating an iceberg. Help yourself to our icebergs.
Yeah, there you go. I'll lend you some. We will rent them. Thank you very much,
we'll have a
Maude.
glass of champagne. We'll have a glass of champagne on one of them. Thank you.
Yeah. Madeline, you're off.
Dave, I noticed you had another question a little later. So if you still want to ask that question, thank you very much, Dave, for putting in the chat all of the references. It'll make it easy for us to find those later. It's very much appreciated. All right, Anne?
It's okay. You don't need to come back to me.
Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to make a comment about Canada and the US and their long-time collaboration on water through the International Joint Commission and the Boundary Waters Act, which is in fact the oldest international act that exists in North America. This has regulated the flow of water across the border for over a century now. My particular question and comment on this is, I wonder, during the times of Harper, these kinds of agreements, the science portion that supported their ongoing modernization to address emerging issues was stopped. You already commented on that. I wondered whether there had been any steps taken to go through agreements of this type and make efforts to modernize them as new issues such as, for example, asbestos in water emerge on both sides of the border. That I know that the agreement covers water apportionment on the Columbia River, and was, continuing to be updated with new watersheds as the necessity drove that. I guess, as an old-fashioned government manager, I've always been driven by the principle that if you have an organization and a management a structure in place, you should use that as opposed to developing new things at the whim of whatever. And that the expertise and the whatever that's been proven to work over time often has application to new things. So I'm just asking whether you have any information to share on where that mechanism is at and whether there's hope for using it to manage new questions.
Well, thank you, Anne, and nice to, I mean, I know so many of your names, of course. You are all people with incredible backgrounds and careers and important work you've done. Yes, I agree with you, and I absolutely agree with why use what you've set up, and it's so important. We were involved in critiquing the compact, which I think was 20 or 15 years ago. Oh, now I'm going to have to look it up. But anyway, maybe 15. But we were concerned that this was a compact to not allow export of the Great Lakes water, except under certain circumstances. And all of the states involved had a veto, but Ontario and Quebec did not. We were allowed to be at the table and give our opinion, but then that still stands. So that was a concern that we had. And I know that the Great Lakes mayors are talking now about renegotiating the compact, and because there's a lot of demand on that water, a lot of, and you can see if you're living in a big city on one of the Great Lakes, and a town 200 kilometers away is saying we're desperate, you can see the dynamics and the pressure, the political pressure on you to say, yes, of course you need that water. So how do we make these decisions? It's very, very difficult. But I was concerned a little about some of the language at the mayor's last mayor's gathering. They were talking about a blue economy. Back to my concerns about the marketization and financialization of nature. The caring of the Great Lakes has to be economic. Well, of course we know that. Of course we know that. There's a great deal of industry involved, but it was kind of that language was creeping in there, and it made me nervous. I was pleased to see that the Trudeau government restored a lot of funding for Great Lakes restoration that had been taken away during the Harper years. So that's, again, to give due where we should. And I will just say, I'm not going to be partisan here, but I worry about a changing government and what it's going to do to support of the environment, support of the funding for all of these important projects. But thank you.
Thank you.
I muted myself because someone thought that made made noise and an echo, and then I keep forgetting to put myself back on.
You're just getting caught up in the exciting conversation.
Yes, yeah, I do that too much. I can actually forget the chat stuff and just keep listening. But thank you very much, Maude. And there aren't any more questions. Richard? Nope.
I have a question. Art has a question.
Oh, Art. Oh, yes. Okay. Go ahead, Art.
Yeah, I'm following a theme and some of the things that you said and others, but in some places water has a bad reputation, and water is considered waste. And for example, you take a look at all the infrastructure that's in every town and city. There is a very heavily engineered sewage system that is there to draw away all of that excess water that seems to get in the way. Every home has a sump pump, in fact, to pump that water out from the basement, because it is a threat. It's going to flood and cause incredible damage to everything there, and including mold and significant health threats. The insurance industry, of course, goes off and certainly indicate that their biggest payout of all insurance claims are for water damage. And of course, this also leads to what I would consider disrespect for water. in many quarters that says it's quite all right to dump old tires and things into creeks and rivers. I mean, we've all seen this, and where people will dump garbage and intentionally throw uh, materials from empty drink containers from McDonald's and all those things into water as if it is not something of any value. I mean, I don't think that way, but it certainly seems to me there is a segment of society that in fact does. And could you comment on that?
Well, I had a little trouble hearing, to be honest with you, Art. There's a bit of an echo. I think you're asking about individual responsibility in caring for water and not dumping things in either down our sink or in a lake and river. And I couldn't agree with you more. That's part of why I wanted to design a project for kids from K to 12, because I think getting to university students is important, but a little late. I want us to be teaching kids from the time they're old enough to care. Don't put that in the water. Don't hurt that animal. Don't do the damage. It's harder to undo it than not do it in the first place. So it's education, I think, is so incredibly important, and starting with young kids is. I'm an activist. Like, I can't, until the day I leave this world, I'm going to be doing things. I have to do stuff. I designed this website, Blue Community Schools, because I want this information out there. And we can add a piece, by the way, on the asbestos. This is an opportunity. This is a way to get these issues out there to teachers, to educators, to parents, and to kids. And that individual responsibility. Don't throw that stuff in the toilet. Don't throw your old pills in the toilet. That's poisoning the water. Don't throw the paint and the chemicals down there. That's poisoning the water. That's our collective water. And when we have that notion, that's what that woman, I think, meant when she said, I'm a blue community all by myself. When you start to care, when you see water as a sacred thing, as Indigenous people will teach us, that gives us all life. It is not a resource for our pleasure and profit and convenience. It's a life-giving source, and we owe it to water and to the gift of life to take care of it. And that has got to be taught from a very young age.
Okay, and could you comment on the insurance industry, making statements that this is their biggest payout is water damage done to property, and when I read something like that, I say it's putting houses in the wrong places. It's the building code. It is in fact people misusing land which perhaps should remain as wetland rather than trying and make a home out of it. And anyway, I'm interested in your comments on the insurance industry themselves. Are they supportive of water rights?
I can't claim to be an expert on insurance companies and individual homes. Sorry about that, Art. There may be others on the call who would have more knowledge about that.
Okay, thank you. You're still muted. Madeline, muted.
Okay. So I think I'll ask our president, Ted, to please do the official thank you.
Okay. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, as these usually are. And I must admit, Maude, I followed you for years when I was working in Environment Canada, and we definitely realized that you were working as a catalyst, particularly dealing with the Great Lakes and various other issues. And we definitely support that happening. nowadays, and with the changes in government talked about, maybe that's not going to happen anymore. And we really hope that. I mean, I'm not in government anymore. In fact, many of our people are not in government anymore, having left in disgust. So it is a little bit of a difficulty. At the same time, we try to bring people who know what they're talking about to talk to us, to talk to each other, to share our ideas. And we very much thank you for being part of the solution. You know, whether we're hopeful or not, at least you got to have some reason to come up and get up every day to make it better. So thank you ever so much for coming and talking to us.
My entire pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Okay, and we will probably have you back again another time, because as things improve, we need better inspiration than we have now. So again, this is now the commercial. For those of you who are not members, very shortly the club will be circulating to you annual dues. We are making it automatic. It'll take about a month or so before it will automatically go to you. We will be asking those of you who do attend these and who work with us, please pay the dues, because that allows us to put on sessions like this. It allows us to keep the website going. It's allowing us to put out new videos, all of which we hope will help make a difference. So thank you again for coming. For those of you who wish to watch this or share it with others, it will be on YouTube. And definitely, please register when you go on YouTube, say you like it, subscribe to it, and that gives us the ability to influence even more people. So that said, let's talk to each other.